Dawn broke over the hedgerows of Normandy on July 11, 1944. The air was heavy with smoke, the sharp smell of cordite lingering after days of near-continuous artillery fire. From the ridge near St. Lo, German observers peered through field glasses, expecting another sluggish Allied advance. What they saw instead defied their expectations. An endless tide of Sherman tanks crawling forward through the mist, their engines growling like a chorus of steel beasts. Tracks ground against stone, mud splattered in great arcs, and radios crackled with clipped American voices coordinating the movement of dozens of armored columns at once. To the Wehrmacht veterans who had mocked the Sherman as a Ronson, a lighter that always lit, the sight was at once surreal and terrifying. They had laughed at its thin armor and its gun that could barely scratch a panther's hide. But now the laughter faded beneath the thunder of thousands. Bundesarchiv Frontline Diary, July 1944. At first, the German line commanders scoffed. "A rolling graveyard," one muttered, recalling the countless Shermans set ablaze in North Africa and Sicily. The Sherman was infamous among Axis crews, high silhouettes that drew fire, vulnerable side armor pierced by the common 75mm Pak-40, engines prone to catching fire when hit. Yet the Americans did not deploy them in handfuls like dueling knights on a chessboard. They brought them in swarms, entire armored divisions rolling together with infantry, artillery, engineers, and aircraft overhead. On that morning outside St. Lo, the Germans watched as the battlefield itself seemed to buckle under industrial weight. U.S. Army After-Action Report, July 1944. To understand this moment, one must rewind to the broader canvas of 1944. The Allies had landed in Normandy barely a month before, on June 6th. Operation Overlord had torn open Hitler's Atlantic Wall with a force of 156,000 men in a single day, the largest amphibious assault in history. Yet the landings were only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Allies struggled to break free of the Bocage country, a nightmarish terrain of sunken roads, thick hedgerows, and narrow fields that turned every advance into a bloody slog. German defenders, especially the Panzer divisions, exploited the terrain with skill, ambushing advancing Shermans and halting momentum. By early July, the Americans had suffered over 40,000 casualties in Normandy and gained little more than 20 miles inland. U.S. War Department Situation Report, July 1944. Against them stood some of the Reich's most feared units, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, the Panzer Lehr Division, and battle-hardened infantry regiments. Their armor, Panthers and Tigers, was technologically superior. A Panther's long-barreled 75mm gun could punch through a Sherman at over a mile, while the Tiger's legendary 80mm turned American tanks into flaming wrecks with a single hit. German crews prided themselves on kill ratios, sometimes 10-1. "The Sherman is a coffin," one German commander told his men. Dramatized composite. Their confidence rested on engineering. But war is not won on engineering alone. Bundesarchiv, Waffen-SS officer account. The Sherman was mocked because it was misunderstood. German doctrine revolved around the decisive duel, the powerful tank outmatching its enemy in single combat. But American strategy was rooted in production and coordination. By July 1944, over 20,000 Shermans had rolled off American assembly lines, produced by Detroit's vast arsenal of factories, Ford, Chrysler, Fisher Body. Each day more arrived at Cherbourg, fresh from Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic under naval escort. German commanders could destroy dozens in a battle, but more would appear within days, supported by artillery barrages and close air support from P-47 Thunderbolts. U.S. War Production Board, 1944. As the sun rose higher on that July morning, the German line outside St. Lo was already under strain. Allied artillery had unleashed a bombardment so intense that survivors described the earth itself convulsing. Then came the Shermans, rows upon rows, their guns flashing as they pushed into villages shattered by shellfire. Infantry followed in waves, engineers blowing gaps in hedgerows with explosive charges, radios guiding the advance with precise coordination. This was not the duel the Germans expected. It was a tidal wave, crushing and relentless. First U.S. Army Report, July 1944. The Wehrmacht struggled to comprehend it. Their tactical reports noted the excessive numbers of American armor, describing them as ants swarming across the fields. Bundesarchiv, Panzer Lehr Division report. To German veterans of Kursk or Kharkov, tank battles had been contests of maneuver and marksmanship. Here the Americans applied a new logic: mass mobility and constant pressure. Each Sherman lost was simply replaced. Each destroyed unit was reinforced. For every Panther dug into a hedgerow ambush, 10 Shermans maneuvered to encircle it, while artillery zeroed in with devastating barrages. And still, the mocking whispers lingered among German crews. They believed the Sherman was inferior, a crude machine unworthy of fear. Yet as the days passed, fear spread anyway. The Americans advanced, not because each Sherman was mighty, but because together they formed a storm no single tank could stop. Even Tiger battalions feared across Europe, found themselves isolated and overwhelmed when facing entire armored divisions backed by unbroken supply lines. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. By the second week of July, the American front around St. Lo was poised for breakthrough. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, prepared Operation Cobra, a massive armored assault designed to shatter the German defenses. The Sherman, scorned as a death trap, would be the spearhead of the operation. More than 1,000 would line up for the assault, their crews trained to fight not as lone hunters, but as a synchronized army of steel. Bradley Papers, July 1944. German officers, reading reports of Allied tank concentrations, dismissed them as exaggerations. "The Americans will bleed themselves dry against our panzers," one staff officer insisted. Dramatized composite. But the reality was already unfolding. Production, logistics, and relentless deployment were rewriting the rules of armored warfare. The Sherman was never designed to duel a Tiger head-to-head. It was designed to move, to flank, to support, to overwhelm. That design philosophy, scorned by the Reich, was about to rewrite the balance of power in France. Technical Manual TM 9731A, 1942. The battlefield outside St. Lo trembled with anticipation. Crews checked their radios, tightened track tension, and loaded their 75mm rounds. German gunners waiting in ambush trained their sights on the lanes where they knew the Shermans must come. Both sides braced for impact, but only one understood what was coming: a revelation of scale, of coordination, of industrial might turned into battlefield dominance. What the Germans could not yet know was that within weeks, their vaunted panzer divisions would be shattered, not by superior design, but by the machine they had mocked as a joke. Her machine multiplied 1,000 times over, roaring forward as America's steel fist. And that fist was about to strike. July 25th, 1944. The fields near St. Lo erupted in fire. At precisely 09:38 hours, the sky darkened as more than 1,500 Allied bombers swept overhead, carpeting German defenses with explosives so dense that survivors recalled the air itself burned. U.S. Army Air Force report, July 1944. Dust and smoke cloaked the horizon, and through that storm the Shermans rolled forward, row after row, engines snarling, radios alive with rapid orders. This was Operation Cobra, the hammer blow designed to break the stalemate of Normandy. For weeks, German troops had mocked the American tanks as fragile and weak, but now, in a single overwhelming advance, the Ronsons became a steel tide. The German defenders, primarily the Panzer Lehr Division and remnants of the 352nd Infantry, had dug in deeply. Their trenches crisscrossed hedgerows, their Panthers and Tigers concealed behind camouflaged nets. Their doctrine emphasized ambush and firepower. A Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun, firing at 935 meters per second, could slice through a Sherman from over a kilometer away. Technical Manual TME 3451, 1943. To German commanders, the mathematics were clear. One Panther could defeat 5 Shermans. Yet doctrine could not account for what rolled toward them that morning. More Shermans than they had shells to stop. Bundesarchiv Panzerlehr Report, July 1944. The M4 Sherman itself was not a masterpiece of armor. Early models carried 50mm of frontal plating, enough to stop small arms and light anti-tank fire, but vulnerable to the heavier German guns. Its 75mm M3 gun could penetrate roughly 68 meters of armor at 500 yards, barely enough against a Panzer IV, utterly inadequate against a Panther's sloped front glacis of 80 mm. Yet the Sherman's genius lay not in superiority, but sufficiency. It weighed 30 tons, light enough to cross most bridges in Europe, fast enough to reach 20 Fort Mabichon roads, simple enough for American crews to learn in weeks, and cheap enough for Detroit factories to churn out nearly 50,000 over the war's course. U.S. Ordnance Department Report 1944. Engineers like William Knudsen of General Motors and production chiefs at Chrysler streamlined the Sherman's manufacture, stripping away complexity in favor of volume. Its Continental R975 radial engine, derived from aircraft designs, delivered 400 horsepower, reliable, serviceable and common across thousands of units. Where German Tigers required 300 man-hours of maintenance for every 100 of operation, the Sherman could run day after day, with spare parts arriving as swiftly as ammunition. U.S. Army Ordnance Workshop Notes 1944. As Operation Cobra unfolded, this philosophy became manifest. Sherman platoons advanced in disciplined waves, each tank equipped with SCR 508 radios that kept constant contact with infantry and artillery. German units, accustomed to Allied tanks moving blindly, were shocked at the coordination. A Panther ambush that destroyed 2 Shermans was met within minutes by artillery strikes, called down by surviving tank commanders who relayed grid coordinates directly through radio nets. Smoke shells followed, and within the haze another wave of Shermans surged forward, flanking the immobilized Panthers. First U.S. Army Operational Report, July 1944. In the chaos, German accounts revealed disbelief. One composite officer's diary notes, "We kill them and more appear. Their artillery hunts us like wolves. It is not battle, it is extermination." Dramatized composite. This sense of futility was rooted in numbers. The Americans fielded over 1,500 Shermans in Normandy by late July, while the Germans had fewer than 600 operational Panthers and Tigers across the entire front. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Even with superior kill ratios, the math was crushing. Technically, the Sherman adapted as the campaign advanced. Variants like the M4A3 carried improved Ford GAA engines, producing 500 horsepower. The M4A176W version mounted the high-velocity 76mm gun, capable of penetrating 109 mm of armor at 500 yards, enough to challenge Panthers under the right conditions. Technical Manual TM 9-752, 1944. Field modifications also emerged. Crews welded spare track links and sandbags to their hulls, desperate for extra protection. Engineers at the Detroit Arsenal developed the Rhino attachment, a set of welded steel tusks that allowed Shermans to burst through Normandy's thick hedgerows. These modifications, improvised or formalized, reflected a simple truth. The Sherman was a canvas, endlessly adaptable to battlefield needs. Engineering Division Report, Detroit Arsenal 1944. During Cobra, this adaptability fused with air power. P-47 Thunderbolts, armed with rockets and bombs, flew in close support of the advancing armor. Pilots coordinated with tank commanders via radio beacons, blasting German strongpoints that resisted Sherman assaults. German survivors described the effect as overwhelming. "We were crushed between the tanks and the sky." Bundesarchiv Panzer Lehr testimony. The myth of the Sherman as an isolated, inferior machine dissolved in the reality of combined arms warfare. The battle itself unfolded with brutal clarity. The initial bombardment killed or incapacitated thousands of German defenders. As Shermans advanced, they found resistance fragmented, command lines shattered by the bombing. German tanks fought back fiercely, but often alone or in small groups. In one clash near Hebekrevel, a Tiger had destroyed 9 Shermans before being immobilized by artillery. Moments later, advancing infantry swarmed the crippled giant with bazookas, setting it ablaze. The loss of such machines devastated German morale, not because the Tiger was defeated by a superior weapon, but because it was drowned in fire and steel. U.S. Army After Action Report, 30th Infantry Division, July 1944. By July 27th, the German front near St. Lo collapsed. American armored divisions, spearheaded by Shermans, poured through the gap, racing south into open country. General Bradley's forces advanced nearly 20 miles in 3 days, shattering the myth of German invincibility in Normandy. Entire divisions, including the once vaunted Panzer Lehr, were reduced to scattered survivors retreating under constant pursuit. German generals were stunned. One staff report to OKW declared the front untenable against such massed armor and artillery. Bundesarchiv, July 1944. The Shermans had achieved what doctrine and design said they could not. Their thin armor still burned when struck. Their guns still struggled against heavy tanks, but their strength lay in unity. Each crew was a cog in a vast machine of industry and coordination, and that machine was grinding the Wehrmacht into ruin. Engineers in Detroit, radio operators in field tents, bomber crews in England, all were part of the same assault, manifest in the silhouette of the Sherman tank cresting a Norman hedgerow. By the battle's end, Allied casualties were significant, over 6,000 men in Cobra alone, but German losses were catastrophic. The Panzer Lehr division, once 20,000 strong, was reduced to fewer than 2,500 effectives. The breakthrough opened the road to Avranches, and from there to the encirclement at the Falaise pocket. It was the beginning of the end for German forces in France. U.S. Army European Theater Summary, 1945. Operation Cobra was not just a tactical victory, it was proof. Proof that the Sherman, derided as inadequate, was in fact the perfect instrument for America's way of war. A weapon built not to dominate in single combat, but to overwhelm in numbers, to integrate with artillery and air power, to embody an industrial system that Germany could never match. And as German survivors limped away from the smoldering bocage, many began to realize the bitter truth. It was not the Panther or Tiger that would define the summer of 1944, but the weak Sherman, multiplied and unstoppable. What came next would not only crush German divisions, but their very will to resist. The Sherman had proven its worth in battle. Now it would prove its power in psychology, in strategy, in legacy. The steel tide had broken through. The question now was how far it would roll. By August 1944, the German army in France was unraveling. The breakthrough at Saint-Lô had transformed into a rout, and the once feared panzer divisions were being encircled at Falaise. On the battlefield, the Sherman was no longer seen as a laughingstock. It had become the relentless face of Allied power. Survivors of the Wehrmacht confessed in post-war interrogations that the sheer scale of American armor had broken their faith in victory. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. For men who once mocked the Sherman as a Tommy Cooker, it now symbolized a nightmare. Endless, coordinated and inescapable. Strategically, the Sherman's strength lay in what military theorists would later call operational tempo. A Panther might dominate a duel, but it required days in workshops, precious fuel and specialized parts. A Sherman division, by contrast, could lose dozens of tanks in battle, recover replacements from depots within hours, and continue advancing without pause. Logistics was destiny. The Red Ball Express, an endless convoy of trucks manned largely by African-American drivers, delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts around the clock. Shermans, thirsty for gasoline and prone to track wear, remained battle-ready because engineers, mechanics, and supply officers worked without sleep to keep the tide moving. Quartermaster Corps Logistics Report, 1945. This logistical miracle had psychological weight. German prisoners remarked bitterly on how quickly destroyed Shermans were replaced. "We kill them in the morning, and in the evening the same field is full again," dramatized composite. The realization gnawed at morale. It was not just tanks the Allies had in abundance, but the will and the means to sustain them indefinitely. A Tiger crew might fight with courage, but each loss was irreplaceable. For every Sherman burned, 2 more were already on the road from Cherbourg or Omaha Beach. Bundesarchiv. Captured officer testimony, 1944. Inside the tank, American crews carried a more complicated view. Letters home reveal both pride and fear. Many referred to their Shermans as death traps, acknowledging how often they ignited when struck. Yet others praised the reliability and maneuverability. "She'll get you there, and that's what counts," wrote one gunner after Cobra. Private Correspondence, July 1944. The duality was real. The Sherman was no invincible fortress, but it was a soldier's companion, always present, always pushing forward. The bond between crew and machine became part of the Sherman's enduring legend. From a technical perspective, engineers continued refining the design as the campaign surged into France. The 76-meter armed variants arrived in greater numbers, while British allies fielded the Sherman Firefly, mounting a 17-pounder gun capable of penetrating even a Tiger at 1,500 yards. These adaptations revealed the Sherman's greatest strength. It was a platform, not a single weapon. Welding shops in Normandy modified hulls for flamethrowers, recovery cranes, and artillery mounts. The Sherman became artillery, bulldozer, bridge layer, its versatility echoing the industrial creativity that produced it. British War Office Technical Note 1944. But beyond steel and firepower, the Sherman reshaped the psychological battlefield. To American infantry, the tank was protection, a rolling wall of confidence. Soldiers advancing behind Shermans often described a sense of invincibility, even if they knew that tanks could be destroyed. When they were there, we felt like giants, recalled one GI in post-war interviews, U.S. Army Oral History Program 1947. To Germans, the silhouette of a Sherman cresting a ridge signaled not just danger, but inevitability. No matter how many they destroyed, more always appeared. That inevitability was as devastating as any shell. Strategically, the impact was profound. The rapid exploitation of Cobra led to the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise pocket, where nearly 50,000 Axis soldiers were killed or captured. The Sherman divisions spearheaded the pursuit across France, reaching the Seine within weeks. This mobility, this relentless advance, fractured German command and communications. Where once the Wehrmacht dictated tempo with blitzkrieg, now the Allies wielded speed, coordination, and overwhelming numbers. U.S. Army European Theater Summary 1945. The human cost was immense. German crews burned alive when struck. Infantrymen died in the shadow of advancing armor. Civilians were crushed between retreating German columns and the Allied advance. Yet behind every Sherman was a vast machine of workers, engineers, and technicians. Women in Detroit riveted plates, machinists at Ford cut gears, and laborers on assembly lines kept the lifeblood of the armored divisions flowing. Their invisible hands turned raw steel into the weapons that liberated villages a continent away. War was not just fought by those inside the tanks, it was sustained by millions beyond the battlefield. War Production Board Report 1944. In Berlin, the psychological impact grew clear. German intelligence officers reported despair among frontline troops, not just from losses, but from a sense that Allied production was inexhaustible. One report to the OKH noted, "The enemy fights without regard to losses, as though each tank were nothing." Bundesarchiv, Intelligence Summary, AUG 1944. That perception of disposability of endless waves was as crushing as the shells themselves. It revealed a truth of modern war. Numbers, logistics, and endurance often outweigh the brilliance of any single machine. After France, the Sherman carried this momentum into Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Germany itself. Even in the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge tested American resolve, the Sherman held the line. Facing King Tigers in the snow, the humble tank again leaned on numbers, coordination, and the resilience of its crews. Post-war analyses confirmed what the battlefield had shown. The Sherman was not the best tank in the war, but it was the right tank for the war America fought. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Armor Section 1946. Its legacy reached beyond 1945. Sherman served in Korea, in the Middle East, and across the developing world for decades. More importantly, the lessons of its use shaped doctrine. Combined arms, logistics, adaptability, and mass production became cornerstones of American military power. Later conflicts, from Desert Storm to the wars of the 21st century, echoed this philosophy. Superior design mattered, but not without supply lines, communication, and relentless tempo. In the words of one German general after the war, "We feared the Tiger was not enough, but we did not understand the Sherman was never alone." Captured Officer Interrogation, 1946. That was its true power, not armor thickness or gun caliber, but the fact that it was always part of something larger, something unstoppable. The mocking laughter that once followed the Sherman had long since died. In its place was a grim respect, a recognition that in modern war, connection, production, and persistence mattered more than any duel of giants. The Sherman story is not of a perfect tank. It is of a flawed machine, made powerful by the system behind it, by the men who drove it, and by the nation that never stopped building it. And so, when the German lines collapsed in France, they did not fall to a single tiger killer or wonder weapon. They fell beneath thousands of Shermans, rolling forward like an iron tide. Proof that in war, ridicule can turn to terror when multiplied by steel, fuel, and will. In the end, the Sherman taught the world a simple, enduring lesson: in modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor.